Okay, today, what a joy, what a joy. We start Hobbes, and this is one of the great treats. Thomas Hobbes was the author of the first, and I believe undoubtedly the greatest work of political theory written in the English language. He was a master of English style and prose, and his work ranks among the very greatest in this or any other language. Leviathan is to prose what Milton's Paradise Lost is to epic poetry. Think about that. Hobbes was in many ways a perfect foil for Machiavelli. He played the part of Dr. Watson to Machiavelli's Sherlock Holmes. Hobbes, in other words, carried out what Machiavelli had helped to make possible. Machiavelli, you remember, claimed to have discovered a new continent, new modes and orders. It was Hobbes who helped to make this new continent habitable. Machiavelli, you might say, cleared the brush. He was the Lewis and Clark of the Columbus. Hobbes built the houses and institutions. Hobbes provided us with the definitive language in which even today we continue to speak about the modern state. However, and this is what I want to emphasize throughout our reading of Hobbes, he has always been something of a paradox to his readers. On the one hand, you will find Hobbes the most articulate defender of political absolutism. The Hobbesian doctrine of sovereignty, or the Hobbesian sovereign, is to have a complete monopoly of power within his given territory. In fact, the famous frontispiece of the book, which is reproduced in your edition, although it's not altogether very clear, it's not a very good reproduction, the famous frontispiece to the original 1651 edition of Leviathan depicts the Leviathan, depicts the state, the sovereign holding a sword in one hand and the scepter in the other, and the various institutions of the civilian and churchly ecclesiastical authority on each side. The sovereign holds total power over all the institutions of civilian and ecclesiastical life, holding sway over a kind of peaceable kingdom. Add to this, to the doctrine of indivisible sovereign power, Hobbes' insistence that the sovereign exercise complete control over the churches, over the university curricula, and over what books and opinions can be read and taught. He seems to be the perfect model of absolutism and of absolute government. Yet consider also the following. Hobbes insists on the fundamental equality of human beings, who he says are endowed with certain natural and inalienable rights. He maintains the state is a product of a covenant or a compact, a contract of a sort between individuals, and that the sovereign owes his authority to the will or the consent of those he governs. And finally, that the sovereign is authorized only to protect the interests of the governed by maintaining civil peace and security. From this point of view, it would seem that Hobbes helps to establish the language of what we might think of as the liberal opposition to absolutism. And this paradox was noted even in Hobbes's own time. Was he a defender of royalism and the power of the king, or was he a defender or an opponent of royalism? I mean, in many ways, to be sure, Hobbes was a product of his time. And what else could he be? But Hobbes lived at a time when the modern system of European states, even as we understand them today, was just beginning to emerge. 3 years before the publication of Leviathan, 1651, the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, famous peace treaty, brought an end to more than a century of religious war that had been ignited by the Protestant Reformation. The Treaty of Westphalia officially put an end to the 30 Years' War, but more than that, it ratified two decisive features that would be given powerful expression by Hobbes. First, the treaty declared that the individual sovereign state would henceforth become the highest level of authority. You might say putting an end, once and for all, to the universalist claims of the Holy Roman Empire. Each state was to be sovereign and to have its own authority. And secondly, that the head of each state would have the right to determine the religion of the state, again, thus putting an end to the claims of a single universalist church. This is what the Treaty of Westphalia put into practice, and among other things, what Hobbes attempted to express in theory in his book. The autonomy and authority of the sovereign, and the sovereign's power to establish what religious doctrine, or what, even more broadly, what opinions are to be taught and held within a community, within a state. Who was Hobbes? Let me say a word about him. Hobbes was born in 1588, the year that the English naval forces drove back the invasion of the famous Spanish Armada. He grew up in the waning years, the last years of the Elizabethan era, and he was a boy when Shakespeare's most famous plays were first performed. Hobbes, like many of you, was a gifted student, and he went to college. His father, who was a local pastor from the southwest of England, sent him to Oxford, although he went at the age of 14. And after he graduated, he entered the service of an aristocratic family, the Cavendish family, where he became a private tutor to their son. His first book was a translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which he completed in 1629. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, who we've mentioned before when we talked about Plato. Hobbes was a gifted classical scholar. He spent a considerable amount of time on the European continent with his young tutee, Mr. Cavendish. And while he spent time in Europe, he met Galileo and René Descartes. It was during the 1640s, the period that initiated the great civil wars in England, and the execution of the king, Charles I, that Hobbes left England to live in France while the fighting went on. He left England with many of the royal families, the aristocratic families, who were threatened by the Republican armies organized by Cromwell, and that had executed the king. In fact, the three justices, the three judges who were in charge of the judicial trial of Charles I, King Charles, the one who lost his head, those three judges later found a home where? in New Haven. They came to New Haven, the three judges, Judge Whaley, Goff, and Dixwell. Does it sound familiar? Yes. New Haven was in part founded by members of the, you might say, the Republican opposition to royalty and to the English king. In any way, Hobbes, however, was deeply distressed by the outbreak of war, and he spent a great deal of time reflecting on the causes of war and political disorder. His first treatise, a book called De Cive, or De Cive, depending on how you pronounce it, on the citizen, was published in 1642, and it was a kind of draft version of Leviathan that was published almost a decade later, again in 1651. Hobbes returned to England the same year of the book's publication and spent most of the rest of his long life. Leviathan was written well into his 60s. He was 63 when it was published. He spent the rest of his long life working on scientific and political problems. He wrote a history of the English Civil Wars called Behemoth, which remains a classic of the analysis of the causes of social conflict. And as if this were not enough, near the very end of his life, he returned to his classical studies, translating all of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. He died in 1679 at the age of 91. From the various portraits and descriptions of Hobbes, we can tell